Good afternoon. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Obviously, these are some unprecedented times, and so as we as a focal point organization about a week ago, we said, hey, what can we do? How can we help our clients and the broader community? And so we put our heads together and said, well, the best thing we can do, let's share some knowledge. Let's bring some of our experiences to the table and help you, our clients, our customers, our prospects, the community at large. And one of the topics, again, not a surprise that we've heard from many organizations, is the idea of, hey, my leadership has come to us and said, clearly, again, due to the various stay-at-home orders across the states, we now have to rapidly roll out our remote access, our VPN, and hopefully some kind of multi-factor authentication MFA strategy. And so we put our heads together and said, hey, let's pull something together. Let's bring a couple of our experts to the table and share some of our knowledge, our experiences with you, the broader community, to again hopefully help you through some of the challenges and some of the tasks that are in front of you as you build towards this full mobilized workforce. So again, that's really our goal for today, is some information sharing to make life easier for all of you. So let me do some quick introductions and we'll jump in. So joining us today is Michael Ebert. Michael is the Executive Vice President of our Advisory Services. Also joining Michael is Buck Bell, who is the EVP of our Technology Integration, which is where our identity practice sits. And again, I'm Scott Maxwell, Director of Business Development. I'll kind of be the moderator for today's session. So let's open it up and just kind of set the stage here for the audience. Maybe not everybody is familiar. Michael, Buck, let's talk for just a second. What exactly is MFA and what is its role in these types of solutions?
Yeah, sure. Scott, thanks. I'll take a first pass at this. So like you said, multi-factor authentication in a acronym-heavy business. I assume everybody probably knows who would be joining or watching this webinar after, but multi-factor authentication is typically just a secondary or even tertiary form of authentication beyond username and password, and it's something that you either uniquely have or uniquely know, although that's not always true. I'll talk more about that in a second. That provides a higher level of assurance that you are who you said you are. And really, if you think about the way that our industry is moving, we'll talk a little bit later about zero trust and things like that. But this idea of continuous authorization has been growing in our industry for a long time, constantly re-vetting who someone is that is trying to access trusted resources. And multi-factor authentication is part of that, right? Making sure on some basis, again, that you have a higher level of assurance that the individual who's asking for access is the individual who initially requested it. So, you know, at sort of a baseline, starting in the early 2010s, or maybe right around that time frame, we started seeing a lot more around this breach culture that has become so predominant lately. And initially, there was a great deal of reaction to say, what can we do right now to decrease the likelihood that we're going to have a significant data loss from breach? And really, two things came to the forefront. One of them was privileged access management of some kind, and the second was multi-factor authentication. So my suspicion is many people have already rolled out some elements of that. Like Scott said, especially in these times when folks are tasked with enabling a remote workforce, we hope to just give you a quick conversational style primer about things you should consider when you're doing this so you can speed your deployments.
Excellent. So Buck, Michael, again, let's take a moment here up opposite on the screen. There's a little bit of a framework, something that we work by and many others. Why don't we take a minute and just kind of walk through this framework, again, realizing and acknowledging that in today's world, many organizations might normally take weeks or more likely months or quarters to roll through this. But why don't we just take a minute, even though some are doing it in a consolidated fashion, and talk through the framework.
Yeah, Michael, I don't know, you may want to take this one. I just chatted for a minute.
Yeah, no, that's fine. And, you know, multi-factor affects you in many different ways, right? You see it every day. Banking often, if you're online banking, will text back. That's multi-factor. It's asking for a secondary identification of who you are, and that's what multi-factor basically is. It goes beyond the simple ID and password to a secondary random process or managed process that validates you are who you are. And that, as Buck said, ties into the identity of the individual. When we look at a framework for multi-factor, often what we're seeing right now is just get it in place. We've got all these people working remote. We want to make sure we can identify who they are and what they're doing. In a normal organizational structure, you would look at your architecture. You'd look at where you want to manage this within your architecture. You're going to look at who's got responsibility, who's got oversight, who's got the operate, and who's got oversight. Is it network operations has operate, and security event monitoring has the oversight? Organizationally, structurally, how are you going to put this in your network? What's it going to manage? What's it going to control? Is it just birthrights, or is it very specific crown jewel or other applications that need a secondary authentication mechanism and a multi-factor authentication mechanism to really manage the access and the identity of who's doing it to ensure that they're authorized and appropriate? The next phase is then how am I what solution am I going to have? What is the connectivity process for that? What are the technical configurations for managing and integrating that into my enterprise? Then, the usage. Is it everybody? Is it some people who has, again, the ownership? And how is this rolling to account management? How are we managing those accounts? How are we deleting those accounts? What is the organizational process for account management and change management? Is it through our normal help desk service process? Is it through a separate identity process? What are we doing? And then we go to standards for monitoring and auditability. How I know when it's being used, if there's events occurring that might be, trying to be compromised. What is my monitoring? What is my auditability? What is my confirmation? And then sustainability enhancement going forward. Initially probably getting birthrights, but then how else am I going to enhance and manage this throughout my enterprise and my applications? So it's a 5-phase approach to really look at it in a more appropriate manner, I think is the best way to put it, so that you understand the flow of the process and the organization of the process and the controls within the process. This goes to your PCI standards, your Sarbanes-Oxley standards, your HIPAA requirements for identity and identity usage.
Great. So obviously, we'll touch on it more, Michael, but I think one of the things that stands out to me there is that idea of auditability. Again, everyone has greatly compressed timeframes. Again, leadership, the business is saying, just get this done. We have to survive. We have to keep delivering whatever it is we do for our customers. But that doesn't negate, and again, you touched on it, the regulatory compliance, the audit requirements. And again, the auditors are still going to come back at some point and say, okay, what did you do? So I think that's an important topic to call out that we'll delve into additionally.
Yeah, we will. Yep.
Yeah. So again, just to touch base here, and again, I think most of us are aware, again, you can see some of the statistics here, most notably how often employees reuse their passwords. So again, the use case here is pretty well documented. Again, industry best practice has dictated for many years, if you're going to be deploying remote access, and even in the evolution now into today's world of all of the SaaS and the cloud-based apps, hopefully leverage some kind of MFA. The other thing I want to call out here, again, that really part of what spurred our need to feel to do this is many of our partners and our partnerships in our identity space, folks like Ping, like Duo, like Okta, have all offered up some type of, I don't want to use the word free, but the ability for clients to rapidly consume and deploy, again, necessarily without executing a contract. Again, they each have their own kind of terms and conditions and the way in which they're offering it. But again, for any of you that aren't aware, I would strongly suggest you go out and connect up with some of those MFA providers out on the market, because then they've all made that offer out there to help everybody roll this out and do what you need to do to conduct business in as secure of a way as possible. So let's talk a little bit from kind of an options and again methodology for using MFA. I know we have a kind of a simple diagram here, but Buck, Michael, why don't we just kind of take a minute and kind of walk through a little bit from maybe from I won't say an architectural standpoint, but what are the components? How exactly does this work?
Yeah, maybe I'll just jump in at the front end and just talk about the baseline kind of options that we often see for MFA. So on a couple of prior slides, for instance, it said 1% adoption for biometrics. Using your thumbprint or fingerprint. In some cases, you might have palm vein scanners. You see those in healthcare quite a bit. Even in some cases, using your iris as an identifier. But biometrics, while quite unique, are often somewhat quite cumbersome because of the specialized hardware that is required, which is why it is limited adoption. I mean, we still see things like just old school fobs, right, that you plug into USB ports or some other hardware solution. Or in some cases, those are cards that contain cryptographic chips, like the PIV cards in use in our federal government today. And those are still, they still have value in certain high security scenarios, but we more commonly see things like callbacks. They may call a cell phone or a landline. The mere fact that you answer that and it's a pre-registered number means, in theory, that is going to be you, and you press a 1, hey, it's really me. That has some problems in terms of caller ID spoofing and some other things that can happen. But again, you certainly still increase the overall level of certainty that the user is who they say they are. You also have one-time passwords, obviously, via text, SMS, or sometimes callbacks, right? You pick up the phone and instead of saying press 1 to indicate it's you, it actually gives you a signature or what have you that you can use to log into the solution or re-authenticate when you're trying to access a resource on your laptop. Other things, believe it or not, security questions and answers, which we commonly still think of as being related to password reset. Sometimes those are used as a second factor. One of the more advanced kind of approaches to MFA is adaptive MFA. This can include a lot of things like geofencing, some identification as to whether or not you are or are not on the network. If you're trying to access a certain resource and you're on the network, that's good enough. If you're off the network and you're coming in through a VPN, perhaps you should be prompted for an additional level of authentication. So these adaptive MFA that take into account multiple factors without your input are fairly advanced solutions, but typically require a little more planning. And right now, we're seeing our clients who, kind of like Scott mentioned, they're looking to solve a problem now, which is an increased remote workforce that needs to work effectively and securely. So by far, obviously, the most common usage that we see right now to support that use case is your phone. Your cell phone is effectively your second form of authentication. It's registered, it's identified. You get a push notification when you try to access a certain resource. You just push the thing and say yes in the interface, and off you go to your resource. Or in certain cases, you pick up a code from the MFA software solution, you enter that code into the laptop, and you're granted access. So the ubiquity of cell phones in this kind of environment, and we'll talk about some of the challenges of this a little bit later on, especially when it comes to help desk and non-employee users. But by far, that is the most, I would say, adopted method of MFA today. So I just wanted to kind of get those out there if you're considering them. And Michael, you want to talk a little bit to this diagram, or folks have had a minute to stare at it. Maybe we move on.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of elements here, right? It's where does MFA play and how does it work and what can it accomplish? You see the single factor authentication, user password, VPN coming in, right? Then you get the multi-factor authentication tied in to authenticate and authorize, right? What is this? Who is this person? What are they? And there's many ways of doing that, as you see on the right, with the primary authentication being Active Directory or Radius server, and it can work across, including a push back to the mobile phone. Again, multi-factor is many ways. It could be your little RSA token that you carry around, or a software token on the phone. It can be a callback. It can be a pushed number. There's many ways which we see it today. I mean, obviously, there was one point in time that banks talked about issuing basically that old style RSA token to every banking customer to do multi-factor authentication when they realized, oh, we can just send text messages with codes. But all that works to say, are you who you say you are, and therefore is it appropriate for you to have access? And, the optional, Amazon now has the option for multi-factor. So unless you're using the same browser every time, if you use a different browser, it can push OTP or multi-factor authentication. I turned it on. As a cyber person, I should, right? I turned it on for that and for eBay and for other applications, so I can ensure that nobody else is using it. If somehow my password or ID gets compromised, then multi-factor is that second authority to say, nope, that's not who I am. And I've gotten messages. My eBay account was trying to get hacked. Somebody got something, but they didn't have the multi-factor. I was able to, fix that pretty quickly.
Yeah, Michael, I think you call it a very good point there. While, again, our primary focus today is for our enterprises and our commercial customers dealing with this remote workforce. Best practice, there are many of your consumer-grade applications, Facebook, eBay, Amazon, et cetera, that have some type of enhanced authentication. Do they all truly fall to the category of MFA? But they will push a code to your registered cell phone, something along those lines. So yeah, best practice, not just from a commercial in your workday. Don't forget about your personal life, because again, we continue to see during the time of COVID-19 and everything we're dealing with, and a significant increase in the phishing attacks. Again, especially with now the recovery package from the federal government, millions of checks going out. We are seeing a huge ramp up in the scams and the malware type of approaches going after your identity, and very specifically those checks. So yeah, this doesn't just apply to your workday. Ensure you're taking the appropriate steps on your personal side as well.
Yeah, and on that point too, we've had a call from one of our board members. A lot of executives are getting compromised, right? They're getting pinged for transfers of, authority to transfer, wire, whatever. We're going to have up on our webpage pretty soon a checklist for the remote working, those things you need to think about, concerned with, how you can configure your devices, how you need to think about security. That's going to be available hopefully by tomorrow, no later than Monday, as well as a email address where you can ask questions. And that'll be available on our webpage as well.
Excellent. Good. So we touched on this a little bit, but from what we're seeing from our clients and from an industry best practice as far as what user populations in play and what are the implications, what guidance do we generally have for our clients, again, out there working through these considerations and these projects, again, especially under the idea of a very condensed time frame?
Yeah, I mean, I would quickly say, the workforce these days is not all full-time employees. So at the highest level, you would say that one differentiation is, do you have employee or non-employee resources? That's probably the kind of the top level user population. But if you break it further down, you have on-network users, off-network users. You certainly have customers and business partners that fall into that non-employee bucket that may be accessing resources. If you consider a user more than just a human and also potentially as tied to the identity of a device, you have logins from recognized or unrecognized as devices. So Michael mentioned a minute ago a browser to log into Amazon, just by way of example. Maybe you're using a new browser and you've never authenticated before, or providing that second factor authentication for that particular browser. Well, that's true of any device, right? That can be extrapolated to devices the organization may own, or much more commonly now, ones that are just also being used personally by other users, and what are the security ramifications of that. But another big category, frankly, is brand new users who have never been vetted. And a little bit later, we'll talk about some of the implications of that. But listen, people are still hiring right now, and you have new users that are coming in. You're still engaging brand new business partners with whom you've never done business before. You don't know these people, you've never met these people. Maybe you're doing a web session like this one. But how can you provide some level of proofing or assurance around those people to register a device, et cetera? So my guidance here is to think through the populations that are impacted by an MFA deployment, think about the risk that's associated with those, and then make kind of that risk and level of effort decision. What can you get rolled out now that provides some remediation against risk of remote workforce? And in some cases, you'll come to the conclusion that that employee populations that are on the VPN are safe, and you may want to simply roll MFA out to those guys and then begin quickly expanding it to other populations. In other cases, you may determine that your B2B relationships present a unique risk. And because of the nature of those relationships, you have to have a vetting mechanism before you grant MFA. And I think we're going to talk about SSO in a second. but you could actually end up providing broader access than you intend under certain circumstances with MFA. So, in each one of these, just think about the risk, think about the value, and make a decision that goes along with that. And Michael, you may have something to add to that.
No, you're absolutely correct. We've slammed this in some cases, and we can't take a simplistic approach saying we have it done. There are other factors we need to consider, as we talked about in the earlier slides, that have broader implications, particularly around, have we put up and put in place any type of security event monitoring around this, and what population of users, what level of authority and access do they really have, how are we effectively managing that and monitoring it. Nope, agreed.
Excellent. So, Buck, you obviously started our tie-in from, again, the bigger picture, right? MFA is just kind of the keys to the front door. Again, I always make the analogy of a house. The MFA is all the deadbolts to ensure the front door is secure and only the right people get in. But once you're in from the front door, do I intend for you to have access to my whole house, or as the HVAC repair guy, I only want you to go to get into my utility room? So, yeah, to your point, let's talk a little bit about tying this into your overall identity and access management strategy, including, again, SSO, authorization, and other types of authentication modules.
Yeah, I mean, so, at a very high level, if you have implemented SSO in your organization, you've already made a decision that the value proposition associated with SSO is higher than the risk that might be presented by people being able to jump from resource to resource. Now, what you don't want is to now have a fully remote workforce. And in that instance, someone's authenticated into a financial system, they're doing something, they've set their phone down, their kid picks it up and makes a transfer of $1 million to business partner X, and you never knew how that happened because you walked away from your phone for a second. So that's kind of a jokey way to look at it. But the basic premise is, obviously, can you identify from a user and resource perspective where there are heightened levels of risk associated with them? So financial systems I've kind of brought up as one example, but certain users who have administrative privileges might be another. And are you applying MFA at the appropriate time? So number one, if you have an SSO solution and your users are used to SSO, and now you've deployed MFA, and every single time these folks access a new resource, they're having to go through MFA. Not only is that a productivity killer, but it introduces bad will, and it's not ideal. So that's kind of the first thing. But the inverse problem is, like I mentioned, you have MFA at the initiation of your session. You have both your primary and secondary forms of authentication, and it's as though that's it until the end of time, or at least the end of your session, and you have no other mechanisms to prompt users. So in this particular cases, again, you kind of got to think back. And I hate to keep going back to the idea of risk and being overly concerned about that, but really that's what it's about. Are you able to categorize your resources based on some level of risk and say that someone who has had that primary level of authentication is good to go? Someone who requests a resource that has a higher level of risk now needs to provide a secondary factor of authentication. And do we periodically request that user revalidate who they are through their devices? So to me, this is just more the basic considerations around continuous authorization. So Michael?
No, that's exactly right. If it goes on to then the governance around it as well, right? Which we clearly address in our governance process. And multi-factor is often used in a lot of your privileged access environments as well to ensure that the privileged user is authenticated and authorized. So it is about that single identity.
Excellent. So as with many projects, communication becomes key. So let's take a minute here and again talk about, so what is, and again for our clients that have gone through this, things to think about, what is your communication policy and what is it being used for within your network?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously comms is one of the most important aspects of this. You want your end user population, particularly in remote scenarios, to be educated, not only on process, but on what to do in the event of failure. So, just making sure that they understand the escalation paths so that your teams aren't overwhelmed. Listen, right now, remote work is proliferating. People are dealing with in healthcare, I brought that up a couple of times, but it's a great example here as well. In some healthcare scenarios, folks are very strongly focused on providing treatment to people who have gotten ill. What they don't need is an escalation in help desk calls because the MFA solution is wonky. So, making sure that you can keep those kinds of things to a minimum, provide failure scenario escalations to your users. Just consider all the user populations we talked about before, right? So you have different kinds of users who may be impacted by this differently. They may have different registration mechanisms in place, different ways to validate either the devices or who they are when they go through those processes. And like I mentioned kind of a moment ago, there are some corner cases that can provide productivity problems, like lost devices, or I dropped my device, or I'm going to keep using this example because it's so fun. My kid put my phone in the blender, or something like that happens while you're working remotely, maybe from home. So what happens now? And I think we are going to talk about help desk in a minute, so I won't dive in too deeply. But you need to have backup mechanisms for MFA. If in fact MFA fails and people cannot get to critical resources, you need to let them understand what their path is to resolution, and so that they're ready to provide either demographic data, whatever it may be, that they're ready to provide information that can be a secondary form of vetting to human beings that may be able to grant them access in the interim. So, really, I think a good comms plan builds confidence that the organization is prepared and ready to roll these solutions out. I would focus here as much as anything.
Yeah, and testing is an important feature in this too. I had a client in which we were doing a major HRMS re-implementation improvement process and upgrade. And one of the IT guys had the brilliant idea, well, we ought to do multi-factor for the access, not thinking that not everybody, like the factory workers, had MFA capability for what they were using at the time for the rest of the professional workers. And before you know it, then the factory workers couldn't log in and see their paycheck or see the direct deposit through the HRMS system. And that was done outside of us doing the significant upgrade and process. They decided to put this in front of it while we were doing the upgrade, and this all rolled out. And we're getting phone calls as the integrator saying, "What'd you do? Like, these people can't get access." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" And here they decided to roll MFA in front of it at the same time. And everybody had it except for the factory workers. And the factory workers couldn't gain access, so they had to go through and change those rule sets. So there's a lot that planning needs to be done, and coordination and communication across the enterprise over how this is going to work, what's going to protect, and who it's going to affect.
Yeah, there's one other thing I'd like to piggyback kind of on that example now that you mentioned it, Michael. So especially when it comes to like B2B partners or other non-employee groups.
Oh, yeah.
You have to consider identity proofing and how you are validating that these users, not only who they say they are today, but whether they should continue to have access. So let's face it, if you're watching this, you've either been in an organization or are currently in an organization in which the mechanism for managing third parties is, Jimbo, your friend, calls you and says that someone's left the company, or periodically you have a true up. That leaving that kind of access persistent for a long period of time presents a risk in any environment, but particularly in the current environment. So again, just a baseline consideration around as you begin to roll this out beyond your internal users is what methods do you use for identity proofing, and what methods do you use to periodically validate that those users still have access.
Agreed. Yep.
So, yeah, I mean, so there you go. That's, the considerations for non-employee population. So, this is all on those lines, right? And the weird thing about MFA, we'll probably talk about this more as we go along, but I kid you not, I think these guys would agree. Under certain use cases and certain circumstances, this is almost like a switch flipper, right? Where it's on and it works and people register, and all of a sudden you have substantive populations that are providing a secondary form of authentication, and it works. It's good. This is good technology. It's these corner cases that can hit you a little bit down the road. So, you may take an approach where you do roll this out to, as I mentioned earlier on, to employee user types who are on the network and have say a cell phone in their possession, something like that. That's a great use case to roll it out and get instant higher level of certainty that those users are accessing your network. But as you start looking at these corner cases, I would continue planning. Don't just flip the switch and then off and rock and roll and think you're done. Identity proofing is a big part of that.
Yeah, Buck, I'll definitely agree to that. So many moons ago, my previous lives spent quite a few years at RSA. Again, token was king at that point in time, and exactly to your point, how do you, especially when you were again talking about a physical device that you had to deal with, the shipping and the receiving and an enrollment process, definitely has evolved and become much more manageable and easier. Again, more often than not, everybody is carrying some type of cell phone device, and so to be able to turn that in, whether that's for the employee or even for a non-employee population, has definitely modernized some things.
Yeah, and this kind of gets.
So, Buck, obviously, go ahead.
No, I was going to say this actually gets to our next two slides: the essential information for help desk, as well as monitoring MFA events. The uniqueness in rolling this out, particularly when you're dealing with a consumer level application and identity spoofing, is a lot of the consumer facing applications have tried to keep the legacy single sign on to maintain their customer base without looking at, well, when was the last time they used and signed into this remote access, and is there a timeout? We time out and change IDs and passwords all the time, but we don't do it on consumer-facing applications, which creates a significant weakness. I had a personal friend of mine all of a sudden started getting boxes returned to his house of false Microsoft licenses. So somebody had hacked his eBay account and set up, you can get Microsoft Office for $40, and was sending out all these fake licenses that, of course, were failing. They had rolled out multi-factor authentication, but left the legacy access on, didn't term. He hadn't been on eBay in years, and they were, compromised and were using that account. And you see that, and that's a poor example. I don't want to, say that, but I've seen that across many applications, many consumer-facing banking applications, credit card applications, online, access requirements where they set up multi-factor, but don't look at the term of the user, the last access, and should they terminate access and make them create a new ID. I was recently on a consumer-facing application where I buy parts every so often. I hadn't used the site in 2 years, and they literally said, your ID is terminated. You have to re-authenticate through, and here they'd add multi-factor. They did a really good job of saying, the user access hasn't been used in a while. We're going to terminate. We're going to make them re-authenticate in, re-identify themselves. That's up my account all over again, which was the right thing to do. So we see this all the time. And the help desk availability to address this is an important issue. What's the workflow to get these people on board? How we manage it? What we doing with legacy access rights? Essential components between monitoring your MFA as well as provisioning.
Yeah, great. And I would say when it comes to help desk, Scott, sorry, I know you're moving on, but just one quick thing.
Good.
I guess two quick things. One is, funnily enough, making help desk your initial use case for rollout isn't the worst idea ever, because they get to experience the registration process firsthand, and they get to be kind of a part of what that looks like for other end users. But secondarily, just make sure that you communicate to those folks break glass scenarios. So the one I mentioned earlier, where someone loses or drops a device, or it gets wiped or deregistered or something happens, that there is indeed a mechanism to allow those users to gain access. It could be using demographic data. It could be calling that person's manager, having that person reach back out to the initial requester. And some of these things can be triangular and kind of circular, but ultimately you have to have a mechanism to allow people to be productive. Define that in advance, because I promise you will be defining it. And you can either make that a good experience for the help desk and the end users, or not. And kind of taking the pass at that in advance is one way to make sure it's a better experience.
Excellent. So we kind of touched on it. What are some of the key things that folks should be thinking about from that monitoring aspect? Again, you're now either possibly adding a brand new and or expanding significantly the use of an MFA type technology. How should the security operations centers and the various operations folks, what should their involvement be, and how should they be helping to monitor the environment?
Yeah, Mike, I don't know if you want to take that. I think this is, ultimately, this is not atypical from any event monitoring scenario, which is, are there outlier events of which you should be aware? If you
Right.
roll one of the solutions out, people are either going to attempt to clone things or to hack it, depending on the mechanism you select. You may get some spoofing attempts to try to gain access with these solutions. But another interesting thing is just adoption, right? I guarantee there'll be somebody that watches this that rolls MFA out optionally at the outset, or something of the sort, like you have to do this within 15 times that you access this particular resource. So understanding adoption rates, I think, is very important to know how your comms plan is working, but also whether or not your organization is sort of from an overall, just the feel of the organization, whether or not they're ready to take some of these things on, or frankly, whether you may have to just go ahead and push the solution anyway. I would also say that if you see lower levels of usage than you would expect otherwise pre-MFA, that actually indicates something as well, which is that folks are maybe not able to access certain resources, and they're frankly just not making a call about it. That could also be a productivity problem. From a security aspect, there are other reasons to monitor these, and Michael, maybe you want to talk about some of them, but some of those other ones are really usage-based.
They are very much usage-based. You have to have good analytics in place to understand the normal level of usage as well as the abnormal. Anything from time of day to number of attempts that you put in place. You start creating your metrics over a period of time, and that's the only problem. In a new implementation, you don't have all the metrics, right? But you can leverage metrics over time to measure normal usage from abnormal usage, and therefore, effectively manage the implementation and monitor it in a maturity way. You look at normal CMMI model, it's measure and monitor gets you to 4 and 5. So what is your measure and monitor sequence to understand the normal MFA events versus abnormal MFA events? And most people aren't tying this back into their security event monitoring at all. They think it's a stopgap, it's a good solution. And it's not something I need to monitor, and we see limited monitoring in MFA, and MFA is a critical component to that single identity and that single sign-on.
Yeah, agreed. So I had this personally happen to me. We had at a previous life had an MFA deployed. It happened to be Duo, and when that comes up on my cell phone, you can basically, there's a green checkbox or a red X. So again, normally, when in that case for VPN, yes, that was me. I'd hit the box. All of a sudden, I got that pop on my phone, and I hadn't tried to log into anything. Clearly, somebody somewhere had found a way to try and log into a web app, a VPN. We had multiple resources protected. But yeah, the simplest example definitely should be ensuring monitoring for any kind of denial. Not a failed attempt, but in that I declined this because it wasn't me, as a real world example. So let me throw this question out. And again, this comes firsthand from, frankly, one of the CISOs that I was talking with about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. It was, hey, yeah, we're considering, because of, again, this massive work from home push, we want to do it securely, but acknowledging the fact that they were going to have to do this in an incredibly hasty time frame, the question that they had thrown out was, is this something we should consider temporary? Should we roll this back once we get back to normal operating procedures? So I'd be curious, both of your opinions to that struggle that I know some customers are facing.
I think some of these are financial decisions. And so, I may put that aside for just a moment. There may be things that people do in the short run and organizations do in the short run to mitigate risk that are not truly long-term investments. And so putting those things aside, making them equal, so to speak, the question is, does this have ongoing value beyond trying to support what is, we all hope, a temporary remote working scenario? And as a general statement, I would say probably not. If you haven't rolled out MFA previously, in the midst of some tough circumstances, this is an opportunity to take advantage of something that will bring you a higher level of security in your organization. So you hear a lot, and I think we actually have a slide on zero trust coming up, so I may bleed a little bit into that. But you hear a lot about zero trust environments today. or CARTA from Gartner, and some of these other acronyms that are out there. They're all really ultimately about the idea that you don't have a baseline of trust that's established throughout the entire session, right? I mean, I'm simplifying, but ultimately that you do have some method of continuous authorization. You can identify the user, whether that's a human or a machine or a system or an API or whatever it may be, continuously, and then ultimately you can identify the resources that person or what have you is trying to access. So when you look at that, having MFA as part of the front door to create a higher level of certainty that users are accessing this beyond passwords. Listen, go out to the dark web websites, your user ID and your password are there, period, for most of the resources that you use. Just because somebody hasn't used them doesn't mean that someone doesn't have them. So you can rotate your passwords, these are all good things, but having a higher level of certainty to try to move beyond a password-only environment, for me, is not something you should consider to be a short-term one-time investment. This is part of a key part of the front door infrastructure to enabling zero trust that trickles down to the enterprise. So my take on it is, look at it that way, talk to business leaders and those who may be controlling budgets from that aspect. Put this in the context of a larger migration and modernization around how you view risk, how you view identity, and how you view security.
And I couldn't agree more. And that's where we talked about the maturing of the environment. Now you've got it in place, you've got your primary birth rates and your remote access and your multi-factor authentication and identity in place. You know, where else do I want to protect my crown jewels? In manufacturing, it could be intellectual property, it could be personal identifiable information because of regulatory requirements of CCPA and so on and so forth. But it's now what I want to do to mature my usage and gain more value out of that investment to really protect those crown jewels. And that goes to the zero trust as well.
Yeah, obviously you touched on it. Again, every organization out there trying to figure out what does zero trust mean to them? What is the value to it? How does their infrastructure, how does their applications, how does their people, their process, the technology, all have to change? So yeah, I think you touched on it well, Michael and Buck, that yeah, this isn't, while it again may have been done in a hurried state, and yes, and we'll touch on this here in a minute, Michael, some things you might want to go back and rethink. Again, the auditors are going to come along and say, hey, what did you guys do over the last 60, 90 days to accommodate this new world we're operating in? But it definitely should be a critical part and needs to be, because again, if you look at any zero trust architecture, it all builds on identity. You have to have proof positive of who that user and even frankly who that device is to then be able to build the trust model. Whereas again, today's world, if I'm on the network, I'm automatically trusted. So there's very much a natural tie-in there. So moving on, we have about 15 minutes here left. So and again, we touched on this a little bit, but what are those best practices? What should people be doing to manage the overall governance of their MFA, and again, as part of a broader identity governance program?
And yeah, we certainly have touched on that management of governance, right? You know, we looked at, and we've already gotten a lot of questions from our risk consulting group, because you know we're changing our control environment in this you know current day and age. So there's been a lot of questions over how you're going to measure and test and validate that control environment as it exists now versus your normal control environment, which is, you know, you're in your desk, you're in your office, you're authenticating it through normal methods. And you may not use multi-factor, obviously, when you're inside the four walls of the building versus remote access. So, you know, what is that governance process in place? How is that being managed? How are we going to evaluate and ensure that? And then how you're monitoring, controlling it is a key component. Like, how are we issuing it? Who do we know got issued it? Was it performed appropriately? How did you identify that person beyond a single sign-on? There's all those factors that come to place from the governance and management and controlling perspective, which leads you to the issues. Thank you for the next slide. Over control environment certification. You look at certifications for PCI, GDPR, the newer standard for Department of Defense for CMMC, which is the contract management certification process, CCPA for the California, and HIPAA. It is, what are the controls? How are you ensuring it? How are you governing it? How are you measuring and monitoring it? They all look for maturity. I think if you look at the CMMC model, in fact, it has 5 levels for multiple reasons. One, level of knowledge or intellectual property you have that is critical to the defense of the United States. But also, you look at level 4 and 5, and it's got the measure, monitor, and maturity model in there. So they're looking for that CMMN level, 4 or 5, because it now starts at 0, goes 6 levels. You're still looking for 4 and 5 in those areas. So, what we need to do for the certification, it comes into play for a lot of these regulatory requirements. Aren't even listed on here. The FFIEC for banking and financial institutions consistently looks for those type of elements around how you govern it, how you're measuring it, how you're monitoring it, what are the control factors over it, and you see findings all the time. The FDA has been getting heavily involved in critical manufacturing processes and SCADA systems in this environment. And that didn't exist just 10 years ago. And they're looking at all levels of access of IoT and how you ensure that it's managed, controlled, and operated effectively, and who has access, how's that access defined, and what data is on those that are critical. So again, very critical to certifications, controls, and attestation.
Excellent. So, Michael, we touched on this, but again,
Sure
I think it can't be overlooked or overstated. What does this mean to external auditors? Again, what do we anticipate? And frankly, I know we've already started to have some conversations and even hear from some of the external auditor agencies out there. For example, where it is that none of the deadlines are going to be pushed back for Sarbanes-Oxley. People are still going to have to meet stated timeframes. So again, under this auspice of MFA, and people are rolling out, what should people expect? What does this mean from an auditing standpoint?
Well, it's created 2 control environments, right? The one that happened during normal operations, and now the one that's happening because of change of operations. And the nature of that control environment has changed. So you have to actually test twice. We've already gotten direction from external auditors in our risk consulting practice that they're going to need to test twice. They're going to have to test during the gap period, which is we're now working remotely, how people access, what were the secondary reviews, what was authentication, authorization, and what happened to normal operations whenever they resume. So it's 2 different operational environments. Additionally, now you've added another control factor to your environment. How is that working? Your whole aspect of control in your environment. And so it's a new application. It's a new technology. It has to be validated, tested, and monitored throughout the environment. So we're seeing an increase in work in that area once we get back to that level of work.
Excellent. So one takeaway from Michael, obviously I heard you say, is kind of double the work to some degree. So might I surmise that a good recommendation for everybody is sooner than later, get with your external auditors, start to bring them into the fold and understand for your environment how that might impact safe assessment?
That is correct.
Okay. Any recommendations, best practices you can share from again, kind of from that homework standpoint, from a documentation process, documentation again? Normally clients might take many months to roll this out, cramming things into shorter cycles. Any suggestions for some of those key things they might want to document so that when they get to the end, again, the auditors come in, they've got some of that key information captured? Any best practices there to share?
Absolutely. So one of the key factors here is we probably rolled this in from a technology standpoint and not from a governance management standpoint. So there's a lack of documentation. All right, we put this in place in a very rapid form. It would be going back now and start documenting how you validated individuals as they logged in, how you issued the multi-factor authentication usage, how you validated the individuals that were getting it and using it to log in and ensuring that control. It's the normal IT implementation process or SDLC process is, what control do you have in place as you rolled it out during the process, and how are you ensuring that each individual that used it, accessed it, and how you're managing and monitoring it, so that when you test it, it passes. I mean, it meets the auditor standard for test of operating effectiveness based on a sample of the population, which is going to be at least 45 to 60 users will need to be tested in this new implementation, because it's part of the total IT control environment.
Got it. Okay, makes sense. Buck, anything to add there?
The only thing I think I'd really add just in closing is, not to sound too grim, but there's an aspect of this that is the new normal. When are you going to be comfortable sitting in a football stadium or baseball stadium again, regardless of sort of the outcome of some of the way these numbers are progressing. So I do think that, Michael nailed it, which is to say, you cannot view this as a one-time or even a staged technology implementation. There is an aspect of this that is likely to persist for some time, and maybe this is just the way it is, for a period of time. So I think it's a great opportunity to enable the workforce and to kind of prove out how effective they can be in any environment. So I would say that taking the governance approach around this is, maybe it's a secondary thought in the sense that you have to have activity today to retain productivity, but it's a close second. And I would make sure that you view this as now a normal, typical part of your governance processes and not an outlier.
Agreed.
Agreed. All right, so let's take a look here. Again, we kind of got through the formal part. We've got a few minutes left. Let me take a look here and let's see what questions we've had come in. Let's see here. So generally understood that, again, people are going to continue working remotely until some type of vaccine for COVID-19 is in place. So therefore, we can expect the remote access and MFA are going to stay in place for a while. Any thoughts on this to share with regards to how do we continue to operate in this environment?
I mean, I would just say the good news is we've kind of been headed in this direction anyway. Over the last several years, you've been able to access, it's likely you've been able to access almost any data from anywhere if you had certain roles within an organization. So there's already been some preparation and governance processes. From a technology perspective, folks have typically stood up authentication services that can scale to meet the needs that they may be seeing of remote workers. I think in some respects, this is a forcing function for additional modernization. And as you look out over, we kind of touched on zero trust a little bit earlier. I would start looking at the things that you're putting in place to solve these interim problems as something that relates more strongly to what a modern remote workforce that also has remote data across any number of platforms that are both protected inside a network and living cloud-based solutions or partner solutions, et cetera. It's an opportunity to start making this part of a progression that continues to enable staff this way. I just, to the questioner's point and the one that we just made a moment ago, there are elements of this that are likely to persist forever, and there'll be a change associated with it. And ultimately, it comes down to the two things we've been talking about for 20 years in this industry. Can you identify who or what is accessing your resources? Can you categorize the risk around those people? And can you identify and categorize the data and the resources that are being accessed? Everything else in the middle of that is an enabler. That's what MFA is going to be part of the solution in doing. When we get past this initial rush, focus on the big things, the identity side and the data and resource side, and then put the solutions in place in the middle to solve for it. That's what I would have to say.
Agree 100%.
Excellent. What guidance do we have for clients whose leadership has kind of thrown caution to the wind, and as a result of that, many of their normal processes that they would go through to create these new operating environments? I know, again, we touched on some of this, but any summarization or what are kind of the critical one or two things that you would have folks keep in mind for that?
Well, document and create history, what they did, why they did it, how they did it, who was involved in it, and who got it, right? Who was it rolled out to? Because it may not be rolled out to every single person in the company. Again, manufacturing entities aren't going to roll out multi-factor to the shop floor workers. But, who was impacted by it? And then as Buck said earlier, what is the value behind it long term too? Like where are you going to take this next? Start working on, now I did the tactical thing. What is my strategy really behind this?
Excellent. Well, we are at the top of the hour, so again, I will wrap things up and thank everyone for joining us again. I hope you found this beneficial, this useful. Again, our intent here was to share some of our knowledge, our best practices with you, our clients, the community at large. Again, unprecedented times. We're all in this together. So whatever we as Focal Point can do, please don't hesitate to reach out. We are here to help, again, both to our existing longtime clients and maybe those of you that are joining us for the first time. So again, thank you for your time. Wish all of you good health, and we will talk soon. Take care.
Awesome.
Thank you.